so.
I think we got it.
Yeah. You think you got it?
Now which one's David?
Yes. Yes, I'm the desiccated remains of what was once David Biko. All right, we're talking about the perfect villain. And this is one of those sprawling topics.
It totally is.
Yeah, there are so many ways to go about it. So why don't we start with, and I'll ask a question, but feel free to throw questions back at me as well, but we can both answer. But when you're creating your villains, is there something in particular that you like to start with? Something that ties you into a villain early on that then you build around as you're working on it?
Well, the thing is, I have a background in psychology. I have a master's in it. And so this is extremely helpful when examining other people, but I'm finding that it really leads to a lot of self-reflection. And I work through a lot of issues through my villains. And especially my issues with my mother.
That is always a great
Okay, we've already taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. That was really quick.
Early to go. Well, I mean, you examine things which really, affected you as a child, and I keep coming back to my mother. And actually, it was my husband, who was my eternal first reader, who pointed out to me when he was reading the manuscript to my novel. He's like, "You do realize this is, your mother." Oh my God! And in the novel, my heroine kills her mother.
Okay.
So, crafting a villain, yes. If you're not, if you don't have issues with childhood, I think your villain should be complex and multidimensional. Because I mean, a villain isn't a flat, two-dimensional thing. I mean, unless you're named Sinestro or Uvella, in which case you're doomed to be a bad guy.
Sinestro, Uvella, I love that. Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to be going through, your childhood going, I want to be evil. Well, perhaps some of you might, but I don't want to speak for you. But I mean, in crafting a villain, they have to be, they have to have enough layers in their own sense of self to be real people, and therefore somewhat interesting. Or you could just have them be Sinestro and sit in the background and pet their cat.
We were saying last night that they needed to create a mouse, the evil genius mouse, and the ball only moved when you went like this.
So how about you?
Yeah, I really like to paint my characters in shades of gray, and I really strive not to have characters who anyone can point to and say, oh, that person's evil. I want even my worst characters to be sympathetic and understandable, and I want my readers to look at them and say, I really hate what they're doing, but I can't question their reasons for doing it in a way. So I like to paint those shades of gray, and I also. I mean, I've been taking notes on my thoughts as I've been sitting here, and also I was doing a little of this last night as well, thinking about this. And I think that I try to balance when I'm coming up with a villain, and we can talk about each of these things in turn, but I like to balance their motivations so that they're both understandable and yet also destructive. Their aims, again, understandable, but not aims that your reader is going to share. I want their abilities and their powers to be enough to be threatening, but they also have to have a weakness and a vulnerability in order to make the ending more than just a kind of contrived series of coincidences or fortuitous events that allows the good guys to prevail. And as I said, I want my readers to sympathize with them a little bit. I was thinking about, and kind of, I was also thinking about archetypes, and let me throw this out there and then see if, I mean, I think given that there are only two of us, and there are lots of you, I think we should make this more discussion. But the Harry Potter books, obviously, villain is Voldemort. And they do a nice job later, or she does a nice job later in the series of making Voldemort come into relief so that we start to see the threads of what made him what he became. But I would argue that the best villain in all of Harry Potterdom was Dolores Umbridge. She was a much more effective villain because you could understand, you knew people like her, you know? But she was so god-awful evil. And I enjoyed reading her much more than I enjoyed any scenes with Voldemort. And I think in a way, Voldemort represents one type of archetypical villain, the kind of all-powerful, huge, the Sauron, the Rakoth Magrim, for those of you who have read Guy Gavriel Kay's Fiona of Our Tapestry. The uber evil.
And I mean, you know, speaking of which, Sauron, does he have any lines in The Lord of the Rings?
I don't think so.
I see you, no?
No, except through Eye of the Mountain,
Yeah,
Sauron.
yeah. See, I mean, he's not really a person at all. And
Right, he's almost a force of nature.
yeah.
So anyway, so I see an archetype there, and then in Umbridge, I really see much more of the type of villain that I enjoy reading and I enjoy writing. But I thought I would throw that out there and see what other people thought.
I always enjoy when the villain and the hero are almost on an equal level. And it's almost like they're working opposite sides of the street, like Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty. You saw them occasionally battle, and I always enjoyed that because it seemed like it really brought the hero's game. The hero had to bring his A game to the table. He couldn't just go, oh, well, you know, obviously it's this, 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 and this. It was, you know, how do I defeat this? You know, how do I deal with somebody who is the polar opposite of me on morals, but is my equal either physically or mentally?
Yeah.
I think when you're talking about Dolores Umbridge, that you're talking about an evil you find in yourself. So she, instead of being the other, she's you. It's but taken to this nth degree. I think it's interesting to use those two examples, though, because I haven't seen any redeemable characteristics out of either of them. And when you say, like, what's the greatest villain out of Harry Potter, greatest villain and greatest hero, he's Snape. But I think it's because he's set up in every book and every movie as the foil to Harry. You know, he's out there, he just wants to get him, and then you realize in the end why, and you forgive, and it's just this powerful, you know, I mean, maybe you can talk about that as a villain. 'Cause to me, like, I want to be able to create a villain that, in the end, makes you go, oh, my heart just broke for you. You know.
Well, the answer to that is you always have a cast by Eric Rickman.
Yeah. If you use Alan Rickman,
That's
right. Right.
I hear you.
I think part of what both of you are saying is that the most effective villains are those villains that actually reflect the qualities that you also have in your hero. That there should be, and this is something that I strive for when I'm writing my villains, is that ultimately the hero and the villain need to be opposite sides of the same coin. They need to share flaws so that the hero sees in the villain shades of his or her own demons. And by the same token, he or she also has to see in the villain something perhaps redeemable, so that the struggle is not always just to defeat, but perhaps to turn before the defeat. Yeah. And that's a really complicated and complex thing to do, but if you can achieve it in drawing your villains and your heroes, it makes for a far more compelling narrative.
I totally agree. Well, I think there's been a trend in the last 30 years or so for the bad guy to be a lot, that it's expected that they have to be a lot more sophisticated and complicated. That you really aren't seeing the Nivellas or the Sinestros anymore. And I also like the fact that there's a increase in the expectancy for the protagonist to be intelligent rather than thick-thewed. And that, because I mean in the past, the bad guys were always the smart ones. And in a lot of ways, that always made them so much more interesting, assuming that they actually had a part, rather than the ones. But it makes for a much more interesting story when you have an intelligent protagonist and an intelligent bad guy, because then when the conflict, the end climax happens, it isn't just swords and blood. It's a cerebral process for, I hope, both the reader and the writer.
That kind of reminds me, has anybody seen the Sherlock series from BBC?
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh. You talk, a perfect example of what y'all are talking about as far as the balancing good character versus evil character. Sherlock, this genius, is balanced. I mean, that when Moriarty is revealed in I guess the third episode? Yeah. Wow. That's just an amazing new villain. I mean, it's just brilliantly done as far as.
Sherlock is such an asshole too.
Yeah, it's great,
so it's
because you've got the balance of this guy is good, but he's also obnoxious. This guy is evil, but he's incredibly compelling. I mean, he's just they did such a beautiful job with Moriarty. You almost want to root for Moriarty.
And I think that brings up a good point in that talking about just villains is like talking about a battery and only talking about the anode. If you're going to have an effective villain, you need to have an effective protagonist as well. And that means that if you're going to build that balance in, if your villain is going to be sympathetic at times and understandable, your hero needs to be flawed. Your hero needs to have a dark side, something that makes him or her still sympathetic, but also at times annoying or even distasteful to your reader. And I think, again, that makes for a far more compelling and interesting reading experience than the Dudley Do-Right, Natasha.
Mouse and Square.
Yeah. Superman is a terrible hero. I mean, it's just, there's nothing more, nothing less interesting than a perfect person that's invulnerable. We were talking about that yesterday.
One exception to that, though, the Kingdom Come series.
Well, yeah, Superman was done well in Kingdom Come.
It was great. In the final scene, when he's about to lose it and bring the UN down, building among the UN diplomats because of what they did, and the anger, it was just great.
Well, that's because he shows a human side rather than just this perfect, in every way person that's infallible and never makes a wrong decision and so forth. You're absolutely right there. The flaws are what make the hero.
Yeah. We had a comment over here.
You kind of led right into it. I have a lot of problems just my villain. Suddenly I'm like, I just want to write about him. And, I don't really care about the hero anymore halfway through the book.
Yeah.
I think you spoke on it very well.
When I finished my Long Tobin series, I happen to like endings that are somewhat open-ended, where my readers are left to imagine for themselves perhaps what comes next, rather than they all live happily ever after or they all perished in a nuclear cataclysm. And I got a lot of emails from people. When, are you going to go back to Long Tobin? Are you going to write more in that world because it was so much fun? And the response I always gave was, well, I've worked on other projects, blah, blah. What I really wanted to say was, I don't want to go back there because my heroes were so goddamn boring that I never want to write them again because I made them too nice. They were nice kids, and after a while I just wanted to slap them, they were so nice.
Well, I would think that would make it a little bit easier to torture them.
Oh no!
Okay, now I'm going to write another Long Tobin. Good point.
You must hate your main character. Well, I mean, in writing as well, I think you don't always have to have a villain in order to have a compelling story. Yeah, I mean, you can still have conflict, strong,
Right.
like in any dystopia, there usually isn't a face on the bad guys. It's
The government.
it's the society or
Yeah.
the culture.
But couldn't you say that that's part of the archetype? That in a way, just as Sauron never has a line, just as Sauron is someone who exists almost in the abstract, that in fact is the same sort of thing as you're talking about.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Very much so.
But then, is it possible that our genre relies too heavily on the trope of having villain and good guy?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a genre thing or an overall storytelling thing. I mean, it's throughout the ages in stories. I mean, you've had a bad guy and a good guy in the majority of the stories. It's just.
Yeah, but okay, but in what they call mainstream literature, something, you read Barbara Kingsolver or I'm trying to think of another writer. Well, she's actually the one example that's coming to mind right now. But they're human stories.
They're so boring. I'm sorry.
Well, okay. Yeah.
Because a good story.
But at least they got out of the dichotomy.
Well, I thought we were talking good stories.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, did I say that? I want to have a film too. God.
You're out.
Can we edit?
Barbara, her name's Eugie Foster. She lives right here in Atlanta.
Out of curiosity, because that's actually a story that I'm trying to write now, where there isn't a single main villain. It's the entire town behaves in a certain way, and you have your character who is completely at odds with living that type of lifestyle. And that's one of the things I'm struggling with now, is for the meat in the middle of the story is like, well, how do I continue to build this story if, there isn't a face? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the environment that you were talking about.
Well, I mean, in the end, your character is a face, so he has to interact, or she has to interact, with other faces. But the overall, I mean, there's a hierarchy of bad guys, if you will. You've got the bad guy who sits back and pets the cat, who has a henchman with sharp teeth, and your hero is the guy who actually interacts with the shark tooth guy, before he gets to the guy who pets the cat. If that makes any sense.
But you were saying before, like, if there's a single villain, it's actually the environment. It's actually the morals of the town or something like that. Yeah.
So, I mean, the story then becomes how your protagonist overcomes the societal, the expectations and the pressure and the problems inherent in a societal situation which is extremely dysfunctional. It's like the story that I can't remember the title of or the author. The lottery.
Oh yeah, Shirley Jackson.
Yeah, Shirley Jackson. Yeah. It's about finding the strength and overcoming a situation and choosing.
Mm-hmm.
But your character is interacting, I mean, your character has to interact with people.
Right.
So they become the embodiments of this environment that you've created. And so they do, in the end, it does have a face,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, I guess in that way, it's instead of having one person who is set up and is plotting, it's multitudes of conflicts that you'd have to just weave it a little differently.
Right, right. But ultimately, you show the conflict through the eyes of your point of view character, through your protagonist. And so when she interacts with a person of authority, or perhaps someone who's supposed to be a friend, but who is in fact responding to her the way this oppressive society is, that becomes the face of this greater evil. And and in a way, it becomes a more disturbing face, because this is someone perhaps who she expects to be an ally, and yet they're turning around and embracing viewpoints that alienate her. And so I think you still do have the face, it's just that there's something lurking behind it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to balance that a little bit? I mean, you talk about your villain having a face, and in some situations like dystopias where they don't, but you don't want to reveal a face too much either, because it's, the unknown is scarier than a villain, right? So, I mean, you know, I think like Tolkien had some criticism sometime early on because you never saw the villain, you know, and that was weird, that was different.
Mm-hmm.
But it also made him kind of scarier because you didn't know what it was all about or what was, you know, what it was. And you just kind of, he was only revealed kind of sometimes through your protagonists and what they knew of him. So can you talk a little bit about that? You know, about the, you know, how much you show the face of the villain and kind of the
I think that in the end you should show the villain as much as the story requires you to show the villain.
I think that, I guess I disagree with the idea that Tolkien didn't show the face of the villain, because to me, part of what made Sauron so formidable was that he had 1,000 faces. The Black Riders were his face. The birds that go over the mountain pass as they're on their way to Rivendell, and they fly over and they all have to hide from this cloud of black birds, and they did it beautifully in the movie as well as in the books. But that's a face of Sauron. The orcs are, and so I think that especially if you have kind of an uber villain, an all-powerful villain that isn't going to show him or herself early on, that doesn't need to, that has such a long reach that he or she can sit in the tower thousands of miles away and still reach out and threaten to kill. That's what makes that villain so frightening. So that the face is revealed, it's just revealed in a different way.
How do you continue to make, well, you say that evil does have a face, but like with Lovecraft stuff, it was always the old ones. Those stories always scared me because the evil wasn't, oh, it's, you know, a vividly drawn werewolf jumping out of the closet at you. You know, the character always went up, and then when the character got the information, you know, was left screaming mad. How do you keep the tension up? How do you keep that so that you understand, you know what I'm saying?
Show the tentacles or don't show the tentacles? Is that your question?
Well, I guess what are some tricks to keep tension
Well, I think
believable and you know, so people don't go, oh, it's just another werewolf jumping out of the closet, or oh, it's the old one.
Well, I think you always then come back to the show, don't tell. If you have a big scary, show how it's scary and the effect that it has. You know, rather than simply saying it's scary and big.
Right.
This shape, very simple shape. This is a diagram that I try to use when I am writing various aspects of my books. And what that shape basically means is I like to start with something bad. Anybody who's read my books knows I often kill off a character who you think is going to be the main protagonist in the first or second chapter. I do this because it's a way of introducing my evil. It's also a way of telling my reader, if you think you have a character who is sacred, who is your point of view character and who will never die, think again. There is no sacred character. All of them can die at any moment. And I like my readers to feel that way throughout the book. But I like to start with some manifestation of the evil that's pretty high up on that graph. But then I like to slowly raise the stakes. If you have, in your first 5 chapters, huge evil things happening. Well, you might draw your reader in, but by the same token, you make it so that in order to keep ratcheting up the tension, as you put it, you have to keep raising the stakes and making it that much bigger and bigger until you've reached a point where you can't top what you've already done.
Right.
And by the same token, you also don't want this graph to go or even stay at the same level. You want to be, every incident that involves your evil character, in my view, should just tick it up slightly. If last time they did X, this time they do X plus 1. And the next time they do X plus 5. Until at the end, they're doing X to the 4th power. You know? And if you're doing it in a story arc, an extended story arc, then you need to replicate that curve, say in a trilogy, 3 times. And each starting point needs to be a little bit higher, and the dips need to go slightly, you know, not quite as low, and the ending point needs to be that much higher again, so that you're always upping the tension of what you're doing. And it's to a certain degree, it's a trial and error thing. I don't always get it right. I'll have my editor come back to me and say, you know, you have 3 incidents. In fact, this is a conversation we had about Thief Taker, which is the book that I have coming out next May. Not next month, but May 2012. But he said, you have 3 encounters with this evil. And the first one works really well, and the third one works really well, but the second one does nothing to raise the stakes. You could just as easily pull it out, and everything would be on the same thread. And he said, so either you need to find a way to ratchet that up, or you need to eliminate it. But right now, it's not doing you any good. So I've been doing this for a long time. I have 12 books, and I'm still not always getting it right. But with hit and miss, you figure out that continuum and that curve that works for your book.
So, okay, you ratchet it up, and it looked like it dips down. What is the dip down? Is that the
dip, as I say, I like to start with something big, something that kind of catches my reader's attention, that establishes, okay, there's some serious crap that's going to be coming down in the course of this novel. But then I like to introduce my characters, perhaps introduce my plot line, introduce setting and all of that. And so I let it go down just a little bit, let my reader become comfortable, and then I start throwing crap at them again until we're on this climb and going towards the climax. Yeah.
Is that like the quiet before the storm?
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of like you're letting everybody to kind of take a deep breath before you.
Right, but that's just me, and Eugie might feel that that's totally...
No, I agree completely. So I shall be very quiet here now.
So do you then suggest, obviously you want the end of your book in mind at least before you get started. So do you use that as a starting point and come down? Is that easier? You know, you want a bad guy that can do X here. Can you then work backwards? So I want him to be able to do, you know, X minus 2 for this encounter, or is that doable, or is that just not, you know, keeping it as in mind as a graph sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that you can go at it in that way. I mean, I think that when Tolkien was plotting out Lord of the Rings, he probably had in mind that final battle before the gates of Mordor, and he knew that that was going to be the climax of the book. And so couldn't make, you know, and I should say that this is smooth the way a coastline on a map is smooth. The closer you get to it, the less smooth it appears, and so there are peaks and valleys and stuff like that. I don't want to, you know, but yeah, you don't want to have, and I think this is actually a problem that Tolkien had, is that right in the middle of his book, he has a battle that has the feel of a climactic battle, and then the action kind of slows down again. It's more roller coastery than it is climbing, and you know, with the Battle of Helm's Deep. But yeah, I think you can use it that way, as long as your climax is high enough that you're not, you know, there's a city that doesn't allow people to build above a certain, you know, and you know, at some point the buildings just get too small, And you don't want to put yourself in that position. So make sure that your climax is both achievable, but also big enough that it's going to satisfy and keep everything else from seeming too small on the way. I didn't say that very well, but
I think you made it clear enough.
okay, yeah, it's clear as
Yeah,
mud.
the problem is that you tend to find otherwise, I think, that your mini climaxes, you have your mini things can sometimes have you building towards the uber protagonist. Yeah.
Pacing.
Yeah.
As kind of a semi-rational, semi-well-adjusted human being, myself as a writer, I totally get what you're saying about making villains shades of gray and giving them a good rational motivation, making them kind of a character you can understand. Like if life went differently for you, you might become this person. But then there are also people in reality who are just born wrong, it's not a matter of morals, it's a matter of chemistry. And you see these kind of iconic villains in
Sociopaths.
Yeah, like John Doe and Seven, Joker and Batman, characters who really don't have...
Hannibal Lecter.
I was about to say, Hannibal Lecter is the perfect example.
And aren't they fascinating?
They seem like they're easier to do in movies because you're kind of an observer. So how would you recommend writing a sociopathic character who really is just inherently different from you?
Oh, geez, I think they write themselves because they're so fascinating and so interesting. And the world is stranger than fiction here. You've got such a wealth of things to research, but that could be me talking from my psychology background. But a sociopath is fascinating because they are so, the way they think and feel or don't feel is so alien to how we expect them to and how they behave, and even among sociopaths they have patterns too. Like a serial killer, they act in patterns. They have actually cycles where they have these periods where they're insane and psycho, and then they're,
dormancies?
Yes, dormancies and lulls, and you can actually, see the cycles across sociopaths, and he's cool. I think I failed in addressing your question, but
I think that it bears saying that even a sociopath, almost by definition, they don't view what they're doing as evil.
Right.
So that in their own mind, there is that shade of gray.
Well, a lot of times they don't really grasp the concept of evil.
Right, right.
So, it isn't a question of them, if you're thinking of themselves as evil or good, they don't really understand it.
Mm-hmm. So that is, there is a certain, there's room for ambivalence there. There's room for making the character, if not sympathetic, at least understandable. I think the other thing, though, that I need to say is that it's the old Tom Clancy quote. The difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to make sense, right? Fiction, okay, let me put it this way. We have some very good friends, my wife and I, and this is my best friend from college. His wife is named Karen, that's also the name of my brother's wife. And his son is named Jonah, which is also the name of my brother's son. We have these other friends, and both of us named our oldest daughters Alexis. It's just what we did. This happens in life all the time. I'll find myself in a situation where I'm in a room with 4 or 5 different Davids. We never do that in a book because it would drive our readers batty. And so to a certain degree, we need to, in representing reality, we need to step out of reality because reality sometimes is too unclear to make for a good story. Other questions?
I was wondering, what's your opinion about introducing the bad guy's background early on in the story? Is it better to do it towards the beginning, or is it better to leave that sort of a mystery until later, like what made him or her the way they are?
That's a good question. I think you want to introduce the background of the bad guy at a point where the reader is interested in finding out about them.
Yeah, it's almost the same as the answer you gave before, where you do what the story requires.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself.
No, but that's tremendously profound, actually, because my answer was going to be every story is different.
Right.
You're reading Sorcerer's Plague right now. I introduce the background of I start to introduce the background of my evil character in the prologue. It's the first thing you find out. But I mete out the details so that the true horror of what made my villain into what she becomes isn't revealed until much, much later in the book. But, we talk about info dumps in our, what I like to do are info drips. A drop here because that's what it needs, and then a drop later because that's what it needs. And so you need to figure out the pacing of your own info drips. Yeah.
Just a question. How do you, when you're writing a protagonist or an antagonist versus a villain, what do you look at in terms of deciding, is this person going to be a villain, where there seems to be a lot more dynamic character, versus an antagonist who is generally just sort of an obstacle for your main character?
I think it usually comes down to how much they act in the story and how much they actually play a part in the plot.
So does it tend to be more like how interested you are in
what they're
going to be doing, as opposed to...
That seems terribly self-indulgent, but I'm going to have to say yes.
Okay.
What I almost hear you talking about is the difference between a villain and a nemesis.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Thief Taker books, which are, each one is a standalone mystery. And so, in a sense, the villain in each book is whoever the murderer was, whoever did it. That's the villain, and that's who my character has to deal with. But at the same time, he has a nemesis, someone who recurs in every book, who my readers are going to end up loving, even though they hate her. It's one of those, talk about shades of gray. You really want to just slap her around, but you can't wait for her to appear on the page again, because she's a fun character.
Kind of like Moriarty?
Yeah. And so it becomes, that's what I hear you asking about. And so I think that a nemesis can be almost a more visible character than the villain, as long as the villain is compelling enough and scary enough or effective enough. The nemesis becomes someone who your character is interacting with on a regular basis, and as you say, who is throwing obstacles in his or her way constantly to make dealing with the bad guy even more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's the difference between Voldemort and Draco.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good analogy.
How are we doing? Well, we got some time left. Got about 20 minutes. More questions? Is there anything we haven't covered yet that you'd like to cover? Don't look at my notes.
He's cheating.
Notes, that's not fair. Oh, come on, I have to question.
Paper. It's really not that hard.
How do you make a villain? Trying to write a story where I've got a villain who's doing something that you might not necessarily disagree with. It's just the way he's going about it that's evil. How would you make him so that you still want him to be defeated and that kind of thing?
Not actually clear.
So his aims are
His aims are
admirable,
yeah.
but he's going about it in a way that is causing more damage than he ought to, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Actually sounds like a very interesting
Yeah,
villain.
I mean, it's...
Seriously, no, I like that.
It's the age-old question of the ends and the means and the balance thereof. And I guess it comes down to choices. Are you willing to sacrifice this for this? And at which point aren't you willing to? And the line that is there, that everyone draws that indicates if it's a bad thing or a good thing, which is very vague. But I think, I'm sorry.
No, I've been talking way too much.
Well, I mean, it comes down to being able to show your readers that the actions of your antagonist or your villain are actually a bad thing. It makes it a lot more interesting if you can then show that there's an argument for it being a good thing. And frankly, I love stories where there's an ambivalence to it. And you aren't sure, in the end, who the bad guy and the good guy is.
Sounds like the end of The Watchmen, where, what's the guy's name? It's the Adrian Lyne, you know, he destroys part of the world to save it, so to speak.
Ozymandias.
You know, do you agree with Rorschach, or do you agree with Ozymandias? And that's the central, you know, the dilemma for the reader. A certain type of reader is going to interpret it completely differently than another type of
Well,
reader.
I think the best stories out there are the ones that leave the reader questioning and asking, you know, questions about themselves as well.
Exactly. I think you identify with one or the other side of the issue because of
To make
who
you
you are.
think, yeah.
I'm blanking on the name of the author. I've read a ton of his books, and maybe you all can help me out, but title of his most famous book is Devil in a Blue Dress, the Easy Rollins books. These are not...
Walter Mosley.
Walter Mosley, thank you so much. Have any of you read any of his work, or have you seen the movie Devil in a Blue Dress with Denzel Washington? And okay, then this is useless. Never mind, go on. Easy has a friend in the books. His name is Mouse. And Mouse is, as I said, he's his best friend in the world, but he's borderline sociopathic. And so he helps Easy in his investigations, but he ends up beating the crap out of people who really didn't need to be beaten up and killing someone who shouldn't have been killed. And so in a way, I mean, he's not the villain of the story, but it's getting a little bit of what you were talking about, where his motivations are basically correct. It's almost like his aim is bad. He just keeps on, you know, shooting up the wrong people. He's the best character in the book. So that's why I thought, you know, when you said that was what a great idea for a villain. Somebody who's looking to do the right thing, but keeps on doing it in a way that is violent and destructive, and yeah, I like that.
Are there any tools that you guys use when you're crafting your villains to, like when you're sitting down and think of like shaping them to keep away from cliches and just like how, any structural like clues that you could share?
I think for me, what I use to keep them original is that I'm trying to make them as much creatures of the world I've created as I can, if that makes any sense. Tying their motivations and their aims and the things that make the elements of their darkness to the world building that I've done, almost in a way ensures that they're going to be, I mean,
yeah.
They're all going to have tropes. They're all going to have echoes of some other villain that you've read in some other world. And yet, if you make your world building something more than just a stage for everything else, if you imbue your characters with the world building, just as you imbue the world with your characters, then by definition, they're going to be different and original and make your readers have that wow moment as they start to encounter them, if that makes any sense.
Like specific. Yeah, they're specifically embedded with
Yeah.
like the environment.
I mean, and it doesn't even have to be, you know, they're tied to this moment in history, but just if their motivations are tied in some way to, you know, a war from the past or an ethnic, I mean, and I'm coming back to Blood of the Southlands and Winds of the Forelands. Those books were all about ethnic conflict, racial prejudice. Well, if the villain is tied into that racial prejudice, if his motivations, as they were, are built upon this age-old hatred, that already sets him apart from any other villain in any other person's book because it's entirely my own. And so it doesn't have to be specific down to minutia, but just, I mean, just as we are formed by the world and the culture in which we live, so should our characters be.
Yeah, I'm thinking that what it really, I think the important thing there is that your villain has to have a reason for acting in the end. That's really the important thing and the key thing.
Do you find it easier to craft, when we're talking about evil, a single villain like, you know, Mr. Skittles, we will destroy Mr. Bond, or the generic evil of, oh, you know, this is a society that has slavery or indentured servants or whatever, or this racial type is pushed down? Which seems to be easier as writers for y'all to create and handle?
So I do both.
Yeah.
I
I think it comes back again to what Eugie has said. It all depends on the story. Every story is different, and there are times when it makes no sense at all to have the uber evil, but the small personal evil works perfectly, and there are other times when that's just not enough, when you need something systemic to make it feel effective.
Do you ever?
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally.
Do you ever find that you have evil within evil? Like, okay, you've got the evil society, and now you put a face onto it?
Almost have to, because otherwise, you know, the modern reader needs more than just one villain. And, you know, the guy works the whole, 300 pages to be one villain. You need different layers of evil and, different faces of villains really to satisfy the modern reader. I think the sophistication level has grown so much that, you may have an all-encompassing overpowering evil, but you have to have a bunch of, like with Robert Jordan's books. I mean, you've got all these people that are working for the Dark One, and you've got his, sub-bosses as the Forsaken, and you've got all the lower people that are working for them and so forth, and you've got to have different faces for different battles and scenes and so forth. But the overall effect is that you're fighting against this all-encompassing situation that it seems like there's no way to defeat, but in the end you have to find a way to do it. Sort of like an organization of evil, the mafia of the world, so to speak. And you're fighting against it.
Say the Dark One is Don Corleone, is that?
Yeah. We had a question way in the back.
It was, do you think you should put a face on your evil? That was my question.
Oh, okay. Okay. Let me ask y'all a question, and you as well. I have two kids. One is 16, one is 12.
No, sorry.
What?
Evil.
Yeah, right. And I remember years ago when I finally, my older daughter was about 8, I showed her The Wizard of Oz. And my wife and I were, watching very carefully, knowing that when the evil monkeys appeared, she was going to freak. Because when we were kids and the evil monkeys, the flying monkeys appeared, we freaked out. She laughed at them. She thought they were so cheesy that she laughed at them. And I wonder if evil today is more difficult to achieve, if we have become, if there are calluses on our perceptions of evil and bad and scary, and if we've had to raise the stakes in order to be effective in creating evil. And I'm just wondering what people think of that.
How can we not be jaded?
I'm not sure it's just that, because I'm thinking you're probably my age-ish.
I bet I'm older, but go on.
I bet we're close. And I'm thinking my parents did the same thing. They thought the evil monkeys, and they discussed all the time when they were kids and first saw. And when I first saw the evil monkeys myself, and again, I'm in your generation, I thought they were amusing. It never for a moment occurred to me that anyone would be frightened of them. But then I was
scared the piss out of me.
I was never frightened of Frankenstein. I was never frightened of Dracula. I was never frightened of most of these things, and I laughed at The Exorcist. So I'm not sure that it's so much a matter of time or people becoming more sophisticated now or becoming more jaded now. I think it's just individuals and what they personally have read.
Yeah, I don't think this is generational. I think this is you.
I was going to point out that when I saw The Exorcist, which I love because I review that a lot, I talk about it a lot. When I saw The Exorcist, I was in a whole theater of people, and they giggled. It was a theater of giggling, and everyone used to say, "Oh, when we saw it, we were so frightened of it." Now, try and find somebody who watches the movie without laughing.
Well,
it's very difficult.
It's special effects, though, right?
But also, you've got some
It's
really,
conceptual.
it's very hard to scare you. You watch things with a grin on your face that would really.
Granted, I don't get frightened. Yes, that's true.
Yes.
But that's saying I don't think it's generational. I don't think that. I think you could still frighten people with the same thing. I think it's individual.
I disagree. I've got to completely disagree with that. I work with kids. I work in a juvenile jail, so I get to see many evil, and the callousness used to. I can tell you, 90% of the girls we got came in either for drugs, or they ran off and their mom or dad took out a warrant to help the police catch them so they could get them back home. It was either drugs, runaway, or shoplifting. Those were the three categories all girls came in. Once in a great while, you get a girl in for a fight. Nowadays, over half the girls I've got are for fighting, and the crimes among boys are becoming more violent. And I hear the kids talking. They're talking about, yeah, well, I got shot in the leg. When I was a kid, kid got in a fight. Two guys had a disagreement. You got off the bus stop. You beat each other up. And the next day you came to school with your bruises and whatnot. That was the end of it. And if
the good old days.
Yeah, well, and I know this is going to good old days, but with the increased level of violence everywhere. I mean, used to, you turned on the TV, the news, they show a crime scene, all you would see was the outside of the house and maybe the tank and the police lights, if that much. Nowadays, they're running the camera up and, you're seeing splatter patterns, and it's like...
raising the stakes, because now when they're looking at video games like Halo and
Call of Duty,
and I mean it's so graphic. Movies like Saw coming out that you can't.
Oh, nothing like seeing an episode of House sometimes is really graphic.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's got to do with our movie ratings as well, because you can get away with a PG-13 movie with violence, but you can't have sex in it. And kids are growing up with much more violence ready-handed. That, yeah, you're raising the stakes, and people also they have a desensitization to what is death, what is violence.
I think you're looking at too narrow a time period there, though. I mean, go back to, 70 years ago, and there wasn't a person in, 80 years ago, 90 years ago, there wasn't a person in the country who hadn't seen somebody die of the plague, from World War I. There wasn't anyone who didn't see someone die horribly. Anywhere. Every single person alive saw that.
Dismemberment?
Go back. Go back to the 50s, and you've got lynchings all over the place. Go back to further back. I've got a great aunt great aunt who shot someone just because he came on their property to sell brushes. There's lots of violence. It's just that
they existed. They weren't on YouTube.
They weren't on television, but I'm not sure that television
Well, the other thing is, in my grandparents' generation, everybody went out. It's time for supper. You grabbed the chicken, you wrung the neck, you plucked it, you took it aside, you cleaned it. When it was time to slaughter the hogs, you know, there was blood and guts to be slaughtered and stuff like that. So there's, you know, to sit there and say, oh, the kids today see, like you say, graphic art blood. Some of them see real blood.
Right.
There's some differences there.
No, that's a very good point.
I can
Yeah,
see-
wait,
I
I'm sorry. There's somebody in back who's
I
been.
do think that there is a cyclical sort of process here. Like, think about the 80s, all the shiny, happy endings and silly, funny things, and we've gotten to a point. I'm an English teacher, but I'm also in a YA Lit writers group, and everything is dystopian right now. I mean, that's all they want to read is dystopian everything, and if it's not dystopian enough, it gets ignored. And I'm kind of missed the 80s where, you know, there were happy endings to things, and, you know, that you find it. And Rowling did a good job with that when, you know, there's this epic fight, but it's a little sad at the end. She did it a little more depressing than I probably would have, but ultimately they won. But we're losing that right now because everything of the youth, everything, the Hunger Games and everything's very sad and dystopian, and I'm thinking that we're going to go back to the shiny, happier thing after a point, because everybody will get tired of it. And
Yeah.
I was just going to say about how he was saying, I think what he was trying to say is that we think that there's more violence now with video games and TV shows than there was, you know, 100 years ago. For me personally, being of the younger generation, I play games like Halo. I can sit there and destroy a monster and watch blood splatter all over the place. If I was to see a chicken get its neck broken, I'd probably faint. So, and I mean, if I was to go to war and see someone get their arm blown off, that to me is so much more violent than a video game or reading a violent book. Because that way, it's almost less violent because you're getting your crazy out fictionally rather than going and physically doing something.
I have about 5 minutes, so.
Okay.
My 8-year-old niece, when she was about 5, she watched a couple of scary things, like, you know, she started getting goosebumps and stuff, and I would see those things. And my sister was kind of worried that that would give her nightmares, and it didn't. And then she watched a nature show, and she was freaked out for like a week, having nightmares. And it's because she knew at that age, at 5, 6, that that wasn't real what she watched on Goosebumps and everything, and that was fine. Watching a snake eat something freaked her out, you know, because she knew that was a real life thing. So she already was distinguishing very easily between the two.
It could also go to sort of changing our understanding of what evil is, you know, where you sort of originally define it as being blood and guts, and now it's like we understand that blood and guts isn't evil. Evil is maybe the thing that causes the blood and gut battles, things like that. So.
And sometimes it's a good thing to have blood and guts. Sometimes it's a necessary thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I just think to a certain point the discussion has been a little bit muddled. I think whether or not society is more violent, I think certainly with video games and TV, when in the, you know, certainly video games, you know, and movies are fictional, and when you're trying to make the fictional bad guy be scary or, you know, the flying monkey, I do think that the extra exposure to video games, I mean, I think it's undeniable that, well, if you want to refer to actual violence and what society sees, but as far as we're dealing in the realm of fiction, as far as what is out there fiction-wise, violent-wise from early ages, is definitely more graphic and out there, and I do think it's a lot harder to get past the flying monkeys.
Y'all gonna be thinking about flying monkeys for the rest of the day.
Yes, I had a thought when you asked that question. I remembered back to probably about the mid-90s or so, late 90s. There were a lot of movies that came out, a lot of them were direct-to-TV, and they weren't very good. They had villains that were bumbling and incompetent. And I can't remember any specific titles, because they weren't memorable movies, but it annoyed the crap out of me. I mean, I was fairly young at the time, and I'm like, why do these villains suck? You know, they can't do anything right. And why am I afraid for these heroes? Because the villains, they're going to trip and
Were the
cause a lot
heroes
of
at all competent as well?
Usually they were not that highly competent.
Because I'm thinking it's really not much of a...
Yeah, so the
not
conflict
much of a
wasn't very
challenge
good.
then.
But I was thinking of it in terms of that of, I want to be afraid for the fate of the hero. And if you don't have a villain who can create that fear in me, then I'm just annoyed with the story. And I don't think necessarily there has to be an up in the level of violence. There has to be an up in the level of my emotional reaction.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not having that emotional reaction, then I'm annoyed and I want to throw the book across the room. I did that with a book recently. It was by by David Eddings, actually. And I've liked many of his books when I was younger, but this recent book that he had released, I couldn't finish it. I was like, the characters are stupid, the villains are stupid, this whole book is stupid. I can't stand this. And I've never put down an epic fantasy book in my life, and I had to do that to this one. So, yeah, that was just my point. It has to be emotional.
All right, well, I think we are at 11 o'clock. Did you have any final thoughts?
No, good. That was a fantastic question.